Oh, God, yeah, I know.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to brush your cars off this morning to come to our first snowy book sandwich in of the season. We are glad we made it to December before we had to say that, and we are
Yes.
very happy to have Athene here with us today. Just a few housekeeping tips before we start. For safety purposes, if there's a need to evacuate the building, the door on my right, your left, is our closest exit. For anyone using a hearing aid, we invite you to take advantage of our induction loop system. It amplifies all sound coming through this microphone. Along those lines, please wait until you have this microphone when we do Q&A so that everyone can hear and participate. Please silence or turn off your cell phones now so we do not disrupt the speaker. And we'd like to thank the Friends of Brighton Memorial Library for sponsoring our program and our whole series. Please grab one of our December program brochures. They are on the table by the door. Also, if you need one of our handouts or would you like an extra handout that Athene prepared for today, they're also on the door. Raise your hand, we'll get one to you. All right, so Athene Goldstein grew up in Baltimore. She earned her Master's of Arts in Teaching from Johns Hopkins University and taught for decades. She is a frequent book discussion leader and a huge reader, and we are happy we see her here all the time, even when she is not presenting. She's a proud mother and grandmother who always brings details to the history in her reviews, whether she is reviewing a historical fiction for us or a book of nonfiction. So we are very happy to have her here today. Thank you, Athene.
It's a pleasure to be here again. Thank you for. This is my third time, and Jackie, please. And I hope you'll invite me again. I'm going to talk about the book first, about Eric Larson, and then I will have a couple of remarks, and then we will discuss. I've read a number of Eric Larson's book. I do not think this was one of his best. I think and I see you're all nodding already. I think his best was The Splendid In the Garden of Beasts about, if you haven't read that one, I'll even come in when it's not book time and we can discuss it. I think the book is brilliant. And it's about 1934-36, and about the ambassador of the United States to Germany. And it's quite remarkable in the way it's written and in the information. I thought The Splendid and the Vile about Churchill was an entertaining book and really worth reading. Also, The Devil in the White City about the exhibition in Chicago, and the book about the Lusitania. I read this book and I thought it was workmanlike. In fact, somebody back there nodded when I said that to her. She says, mm-hmm. And I'm wondering the following.
Sorry, that was me.
I'm wondering the following. In 2016, after Trump was elected, there were a number of books that came out about Trump and scholarship. There was a book written by a Shakespeare scholar about tyranny and Shakespeare and Trump. I think the author was Shapiro, but I'm not sure. Well worth it. He talks about Trump, he talks about Richard III. It's quite an unusual book. Other books came out in a similar vein. And I am wondering if at some point the author's publishers went to him and said, we can latch on to this and we can do something in this vein. And I'm wondering if this book, which came out, as he says, a result of January the 6th, I'm sure that's what he's saying, but I'm wondering whether there was a little pressure from his publishers. I found the book workmanlike and, quite frankly, a little long. And I never feel that way about Eric Larson, but I felt this book took too long to say what he had to say. And I think it was too much detail. We do not need to hear about every single moment at the fort. It was panned by the New York Times. Those of you who haven't, I do suggest you read the article. I thought it was quite good. So having said that, let's talk about the book itself. Those of you who have the book, would you turn to page 196. If you don't have it, do not worry, I will read. Because I think we have to talk, and I think this is, I think, one of the problems of the book. He is so caught up with the events that he is doing little or no analysis of the material. People are nodding. This is good. Okay. He is not a historian, which he's not. He's a journalist. There's a difference between a journalist and a historian, because a historian's going to be looking at trends. A historian's going to be looking at other um, events that might be similar, whereas a journalist is going to basically narrate what has been happening. And I think that's what he's doing, a little too much detail. I'm going to read on the bottom of page 196, those of you who have it. I want you to think about narrative, because I think what this book is about narrative, and what it needs to teach us is how we respond to the narrative. And in light of the last election, I think we have to be thinking about the narrative. What was the narrative of both parties? I mean, what did they all say in the speeches, in the writing? What did they get across to us, so that we, the voters, knew how the candidates felt about the issue and how the voters respond? Abolitionists and their allies impugn the honor of the entire Southern white race. For if slavery were indeed an evil, then the South itself was evil, and its echelons of gentlemen, the chivalry, were nothing more than moral felons. Yet the chivalry, thanks to Edmund Ruffin, James Hammond, and others, had persuaded themselves of a different reality. Slavery was a positive good. It was endorsed by the Bible and by anthropological observation, even to famed Northern, and that's in italics, anthropologists Louis Agassiz and Charles Morton, both of Harvard, no less, had proclaimed on the basis of purportedly scientific research that the Black race was not only inferior, but a different species altogether. If slavery was good, by the way, it should be if slavery were good, but then slave owners were good. And anyone who said otherwise already abraded their honor, something no Southerner could forgive. Lincoln had only a partial grasp of this reality. Quote, "You think slavery is right and ought to be extended," Lincoln wrote in a December letter to Alexander Little Ellick Stephens, the Georgia congressman. "We think it is wrong and ought to be restricted." Just remember, he was not an abolitionist. Lincoln, was not an abolitionist at that point. He was perfectly happy to have slavery contained, not eradicated. That, I suppose, is the rub. It certainly is the only substantial difference between us. But it was here in this clash of moral perception that hatred simmered and violence became impregnable. More than simply a, quote, substantial difference, end quote. It was a chasm that even the most generous package of concessions could never bridge. So, if we think about this particular passage, then we need to think about what is the narrative. What was the narrative in 1861? The narrative for the South was chivalry, slavery as not only not evil, but a positive force, and the North. If we extrapolate from this, how can we discuss the recent events in our history? Because just reading the book doesn't inform us. That's a nice the academics love the word inform. They don't mean to tell you something, they mean that how it changes your ideas, okay? How does this inform our view of the events of the last several years in terms of what is perceived as the narrative? Okay? I don't need to do all the talking. We need to talk. Somebody has to say something. Yes, who would like to start? Go ahead.
I'm just wondering, what would it be? How would he draw some sort of conclusion to either one of those things? How would he draw a conclusion between, or draw a significant, what's the word I want? Difference between them.
He doesn't.
Right, he doesn't. But what would you have done? I mean, how would you have said something about Lincoln that was like Trump or something like that? I mean, I just don't know
what he would say.
I mean, maybe there isn't any way to say it because there isn't a way. But if there were, what would you suggest that he would have done?
I'd like to hear from somebody else before. Jackie, did you have something else? No? I mean, go ahead, please. No, nobody. How do you think he would come down on this? He, Eric Larson. That's what you're saying.
Yes.
How would he come down in 2024 on?
Or what could the Democrats have said? You know, you're just like the Southerners, or you're saying things like Abraham Lincoln said in 1860. I mean, neither one of them is really a good, what's the word I want, parallel, or there's no crossroads there.
Yes, but it's really, I'm wondering whether Eric Larson is saying the narrative was so disjointed, and that there was really very little meeting grounds. Certainly, the narrative on the Republicans was very clear in terms of immigration, in terms of jobs, in terms of the economy. So there was not really much. There was not,
there was just a lot of finger pointing.
Well, and you could say there was a lot of finger pointing on both sides. The abolitionists were pointing, and certainly the Southerners were pointing as well. So there's a lot of finger pointing, and so we might say that there was a lot of similarity in 1861 between what was going on in the South and of course what was going on in the North and here in the United States. I don't think I read, and I was looking, by the way, looking for any comments by Eric Larson. Yes.
Sorry, I misunderstood your question. I think
what? Thank you, dear.
I think the reality is different for those two groups of people.
Okay. When you say two groups of people, you mean?
Well, if you're talking now about Republicans versus Democrats in the latest election, I think the reality was very different. It wasn't, and the reality in Eric Larson's book, which unfortunately I didn't read, but the reality there was possibly also very, very different. What the one group thought the other one, or rather, what the one group thought would matter to people didn't at all.
Okay.
And maybe that's a similar situation.
Well, one of the things I'm thinking about is that in the Civil War time, it was a way of life. They were so afraid of losing their way of life.
Absolutely.
This, where I'm the, king of my household and I have everything. And that fear is the same thing we hear from the Republican side.
Fabulous.
If we give women their right to do with their body however they want, then we we're fearful of what might come. If we let immigrants in, we are fearful of what might happen. And so I think that, to me, that's sort of the similarity
Yes, interesting.
in the two times.
Yes.
And now it's like, okay, how did we get out of that? So that we get out of the mess we're in right now.
I struggle. I came to hear about the Civil War in this book, and it's turning into a
What?
political discussion, and not everyone agrees with the politics of today. I don't think we should venture into
Okay.
current day. I want to hear the history of the Civil
Okay.
War, and I struggle very much with the stance on abortion. I might be the only one here, and I'm okay with that.
Okay.
I'm okay with that. I respect your opinion, but I really want to hear about the Civil War. I want to hear about Lincoln. I find him fascinating. I want to hear about, there's so much about him I thought I knew, and I'm learning more about him. But I really don't want to get into a political discussion about him right now.
That's it. That's very, thank you. I'll go back to the Civil War, but the problem is, I don't think we should be reading. I think it's important for us when we read to be taking something from that and saying, okay, this is what happened then. How can we look at our current times with that?
Absolutely, but
now we're back to 1861. And yes.
The thing that struck me is that is that I don't think that I ever learned much about the South in school. We learned about the North.
And that's where I was going.
What I found very interesting in this is that you really did learn about the South and the North, and that really the North did not want a war either, but they just got eaten up.
I found it fascinating. You're absolutely right about the view of the South. And now we're back to 1861. He's fairly even if you think about it. Eric Larson, is going back and forth between Charleston and Fort Sumter, right? What he does not do, and I think that is, and we need to discuss that first and foremost. In the article, it says there's very little mention of blacks. It's almost like the blacks are erased from this. He talks about the enslaved people who are working on the fortifications, but he doesn't discuss the blacks in any way, because in the South, it's about the slave owners. It's not about the enslaved population. Pardon? What?
And that is that it seemed to me that very little property was fought over in this book. It was that one little island out there, and all in there, and I always grew up thinking the Civil War, it took everybody and everything. So maybe this is the time, because this is the early time, and he just rushes over the end time at the end of the book.
Historically speaking, most of the destruction was in which state? Pardon? Which state had the most destruction, other than
Georgia.
what? And Sherman marching to the Georgia along that swath. But if you're taking the South as a whole, what state had most of the fighting? Virginia. Bull Run, Manassas, Antietam. Most of the major battles were, but this, of course, is much later. Much later. So the question, of course, is, here you have this Southern mentality, and he talks about the dueling code, the code duello. That, I think, was a brilliant, brilliant device, because he frames everything in terms of this code of honor. to which the Southern gentlemen need adhere. That only works as long as you are in this gentlemanly agreement. Once you have conflict, that's not going to work. The Civil War was one of the, first of all, we lost, he's, by the way, a little off in terms of numbers. I think 618,000 men or people died over, but you, of course, had both sides. Why was the number so high?
Disease. Yeah.
What? Disease, number one, but there was another reason. Disease, very poor medical. The first real conflict with modern weapons.
Was what?
Modern weapons with, he talks about artillery. He talks about the cannon. The modern weapons really took a leap forward in the 1850s, and by 1860s, they were using modern cannons. So people died left and right. Before that, you had people on horseback. Yes, they all died, but you didn't have that many casualties. Now you have casualties, high casualties on both sides. So the code duello only works as long as you have chivalry. And once you have no chivalry, then it's not, all bets are off. Let's talk about Anderson. I'd like to read to you 385. For those of you who have the book, 385. I am sure that I shall not be left without instructions. This is Anderson writing to his superiors in Washington. Remember also, ladies and gentlemen, that this is an internal conflict, and most of Buchanan's cabinet were Southerners, and the minute conflict arose, they all resigned in great number. After 30-odd years of service, I do not wish it to be said that I have treasonably abandoned a post and turned over to unauthorized persons public property entrusted to my charge. I am entitled to this act of justice at the hands of my government, and I feel confident I shall be not disappointed. What to do with the public property and where to take my command are questions to which answers will, I hope, be at once returned. He, of course, is running out of food. They have ammunition, but that's not the issue. It's the food, the water. Let's talk about that.
I don't understand what public property he's talking about.
He's on Fort Sumter. That's government property. It's government property. Charleston says, get off.
The South says it's theirs.
What?
The South says it's there, or Charlton, they say it's their property, not the federal government. They want to take
Well,
it.
that's a real problem, isn't it? And there's the issue. Thank you. Because in saying it's their property, what is the South saying? And I know this, you're going to say back there, I shouldn't be talking about today, but it's really an issue. The question, ladies and gentlemen, as I see it in this book, and that's really what I would have loved for him to discuss, and of course, probably not his issue, you've always got this conflict between state and federal governments. We've had this since 1789, it was 1787 when they started discussing it. And then they've got this real problem because you've got states that want control, and you have the people who were basically Hamilton and Jay, who wanted to be a strong federal government, and this is going to be a problem. And it's been a problem down the ages. So that's why I read this, because is it federal property, or does it belong to the state? Yes.
Is there a law now that came out of
Mhm.
this? Is there a law now that deems anything, like all of the forts, in the country belonging to the federal government? What came out of this at the end? Or are they all from the state? Are they individually owned by each state?
I asked a lawyer about that. He smiled. He says they're federal property. However, ladies and gentlemen, you know what happened, what's been happening recently with names, with statues. Oh, I mean, yes, this is the crux of the matter. I mean, the South felt that they could secede and form its own government and create a different government. And Lincoln said, no, the most important thing we need to do is preserve the Union. He would do anything to preserve the Union. He said, free all the slaves, keep all the slaves, whatever it takes to preserve the Union. That is an enduring principle. Recently, there was discussion of what they should do with certain of the names of military installations, like Fort Bragg. You're all nodding. You see how the issue is alive and well? What do we do about this? What do we do about statues on public property of Confederate soldiers or generals? I mean, the question is right there. To whom does the fort belong?
Was there a deed?
What? I
Was
don't.
there a deed of some sort?
I don't know. I would imagine not. I mean, I think when they created the forts, I mean, there was just the understanding they belong to the government. But what government? Something to think about. I mean, what do we do about names? What do we do about statues on public property? How do African Americans feel about that? Pardon?
Has this issue ever reached the Supreme Court?
It has not, but if it did reach the Supreme Court, what do you think would happen? I don't. It has not. It has not. Well, they're having right now. They're it has not come to the Supreme Court. Yes. Pardon? I can't.
A lot of us don't trust the Supreme
Oh.
Court anymore.
Yes.
What's going on?
The issues have not changed, have they? Since 1861, they haven't really changed. Okay, we move on. Russell of the Times. He was a well-known journalist, and he goes south to investigate. But I'd like to make one comment. He said Seward never went south, which is not true. Seward did go with his wife to Virginia. They were so horrified by slavery that they turned around and never went back again. Okay. Let us talk briefly, and I'm sorry to be bringing it up to modern day, but I really can't help it. That's the best part about this book. Okay. 374, for those of you who have the book, otherwise you will just be listening. Seward, I'm sorry to say, I know he's from right down the road. However, He thought he should have been president, as you know. He couldn't understand, he thought this, you know. I hope I got hold everything right. Let's make sure I've got the right page. Okay. Seward fully expected Lincoln to embrace his proposals. He wanted, to bring you up to date. Seward was much more aggressive. He wanted a full-scale engagement immediately. Lincoln knew that he didn't have everybody behind him at that point. He needed to have, the bombardment of the fort that would get people, right behind him. Seward fully expected Lincoln to endorse his proposals accordingly to a witness, to certain, in fact, that he had arranged in advance for the Journal and Times to publish his memorandum along with Lincoln's expected response. The two editors would then launch an aggressive editorial campaign to support Seward's twin goals of evacuating Sumter and conjuring a pro-Union resurgence in the South, which he felt he could achieve. The Times was ready. Blinded by his own sense of self-importance, Seward had misread his employer. Would you please remember that word? What he did not recognize yet was there was steel in this Illinois lawyer. It glinted most keenly when adversaries challenged his resolve. It is a little difficult to imagine what must have been the feelings of a president on receiving from his principal counselor and anticipated mainstay of his administration such a series of proposals. Nicholas and Hay, those were Lincoln's personal secretaries, would later write in their biography, another president would have fired Seward on the spot. Lincoln certainly understood that Seward was a talented statesman and a shrewd politician, and his sudden departure at this moment would add more confusion to a chaotic situation. Lincoln wrote his answer in the form of a letter. What he did with the letter was unclear. The letter and the envelope would be found years later among his papers, suggesting he had never actually sent it to Seward, and no copy appears in Seward's papers. Lincoln may have asked Seward to return it or simply to read it to him in person. The letter revealed with clarity what Lincoln thought of Seward's memorandum and of his temerity. It was direct and polite, which astonished John Nicolay, who observed later that had Mr. Lincoln been an envious or resentful man, would you please remember those words? He would not have wished for a better occasion to put a rival under his feet. Does that give you a picture of Lincoln? I mean, if we didn't have that picture of Lincoln before, we know Lincoln very well. Lincoln reiterated his inaugural pledge to hold and possess property belonging to the government and reminded Seward that he too had endorsed that policy. Nothing had changed, Lincoln wrote, with the exception that now Seward proposed to abandon Fort Sumter. Lincoln ignored Seward's idea of starting the war. The only hint of annoyance in the letter came when he addressed Seward's comment that someone needed to take America's helm firmly and energetically in hand. I remark that if this must be done, I must do it. The incident remained private, according to Nicolay and Hay. So far as it is known, the affair never reached the knowledge of any other member of the cabinet or the intimate of the president's friends. The Albany Evening Journal and the Times never printed Seward's memorandum, which would reside among Lincoln's papers until 1888, when the two secretaries discovered it and published it in Century magazine. Seward is Lincoln's employee. Would you have used that word? May I come to the present? I know that's probably not. Does the president-elect look upon the members of his, yes?
No, he wants them to
Pardon?
be loyal.
What?
He only wants loyalty.
Loyalty.
So he doesn't care for difference of opinion. He wants someone that has his opinion only. He wants it, that's all.
That's all. I would suggest that you all reread Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, A Team of Rivals. If you haven't read it, get it right. You all read it, right? Because basically what he does is he takes as broad a group as he can get so that he has, first of all, different opinions and different basis of support. Let's go back to the word employer or employee. That now Larson used, that's Larson's choice of word. Do you think that Lincoln had that, do you think Lincoln saw his cabinet as his employees?
No,
No,
colleague.
colleagues. To contrast that, Jefferson Davis in his cabinet had employees. How is that going to affect, now, how is that going to affect the workings of a war? I think that's a legitimate question. I mean, it's beyond Fort Sumter. Of course, the fascinating things, I'll just jump. Everybody got off of Fort Sumter safely. They eventually had to evacuate because they ran out of food, right? So they all went north. And of course, the ships that were supposed to bring the food couldn't deliver because the warship never got there. It had gone to Florida. Nothing ever changes. There's always these kinds of little mix-ups in the government and in the war office. God knows what happens with our new war director. I don't want to think about it. Okay, they had to get everybody off of Fort Sumter, and they did. I think what's most remarkable, nobody lost a life. I think one person died. One of the soldiers died and was buried because he was hit by a shell. Something exploded and he died. But it wasn't from the other side. It was from a shell that in the cannon they were firing. Everybody on that fort premises got out alive. It was the beginning. It started the war, didn't it? A war that saw more than almost 750,000 men killed, and how many men maimed? Not one person died. In the bloodiest war we ever had, they got off completely safely. The irony of life. Okay, so they all get off, and the war begins. Okay, let's go back to employees, because I don't think anybody's nobody's big on this. If you have a group of employees, as Jefferson Davis does, what does that do to the management of the war? Or let's do it the other way. Let's think about Lincoln and his cabinet. You've all read The Team of Rivals. What goes on in the cabinet meetings?
Advisement.
They argue about
They're arguing all the time.
what's the right way to go.
How is the best way? You have people who are who are abolitionists. You have other people. You have Bates, who's from Missouri. I think he was Postmaster General. You have somebody from Maryland who has slaves. You have a tremendously wide breadth of opinion and people with a lot of language. So you're going to have a fairly good discussion. In the end of the day, who makes the decision? Lincoln. but he makes the decision coming from a broad knowledge of what the constituency out there, what's out there. What he's dealing with people from Maryland. I come from Maryland. And by the way, Verena Drive, I live on Verena Drive. You know where that name comes from, don't you? This is an aside.
Jefferson Davis's wife.
Yes. Yay! You read the book. Jefferson Davis, Verena Drive. When we moved there, my husband was hysterical. He says, you know what that name, by the way, I think she spelled it with one N, not two. Okay. I said, that was Jefferson Davis. I said, oh dear. Anyway, fine, whatever. So he had people from Maryland who had slaves. He couldn't afford to lose Maryland, could he? Or the other Missouri, the other, or Kentucky, or he couldn't afford to lose those states. So he's going to be more conciliatory because of them. And he needed, but he also had those firebranders in Massachusetts who were strict abolitionists. It's really tough. Jefferson Davis didn't have that problem, did he? Because everybody was on the same page, right? What did you think of James Hammond? Remember him? With the slave mistress and his daughter?
Nieces.
What?
Nieces.
Go ahead, keep going.
He was a philanderer.
What?
He was not a nice man.
Go ahead, Penny.
Oh, talk all about Pentecost.
I mean, what, when you think about the South and you think about chivalry, and then you read that?
No, it was a little bit hypocritical, I'd say. A lot of hypocritical.
A lot of hypocritical. So here you have this code of chivalry where we're supposed to be protecting the innocent and the downtrodden. And we have this lovely code duello. And meanwhile, you are having a relationship with a woman who has no say in the matter, right? And her daughter. And not only that, what about his nieces? You remember that? Why do you think Eric Larson is careful to put that in about James Hammond and his family relations? What?
I don't want to say it out loud.
Okay.
Say, well, Barquettes for one, or whoever, Matt, whatever his name was, yeah. I mean, people around right now,
yes,
are being accused of these things.
When we think, I mean, when we read this, and when you read this in the book, you think, this is going on, has been going on forever. Sexual assaults on women, on people of color, young people who have no agency here. Yes, Jean.
He wasn't the only man acting that way.
Okay, go.
Probably there were several, but this was an example of one.
Mm-hmm.
And then magnify that by whatever number. Then and now.
Then and now.
And from then till now.
And then. But I found it fascinating in the book that he was that specific about the sexual abuse. Because we like because we always have this vision, don't we, of Southern Southern men are always gentlemen, aren't we? They're always polite. Not necessarily. I just think that's rather interesting because it gives us a different view. Yes,
You speak about chivalry.
yes.
What are the rules of chivalry? I have seen nothing chivalrous in the South, according to Sago.
Okay. Well, they saw themselves as chivalrous because they saw themselves as like the knights of old. They were going to be there to protect their women folk, their white, mostly their white wives and daughters. And they felt that they were behaving. They could ride, they could hunt. They were the upper classes. They were gentlemen, as opposed to the people in the North, most of whom were merchants, businessmen, not elegant gentlemen who own property. And the word actually chivalry comes from what word? You should all know this. Anybody who takes French knows this word. Cheval. Chevalier. Horse. Horse. The knight was on the horse. Everybody else was on the ground. The chivalry, the knight, chivalry was a knight's responsibility to protect the innocent. One more thing before we close. I hope this has been at least erudite. Page 432, in case you think the North doesn't have honor. He was now drenched. This is Edmund Ruffin. He had not bathed for days. His white hair clung to his scalp and hung over his shoulders. Out of sympathy or pity, Ruffin was invited by various gun crews to fire their cannon, and the old secessionist, musket in hand, made his way from gun to gun, drawing cheers as cannons boomed and smoke billowed. Projectiles of all configurations flew towards Sumter at 1,700 feet per second. He was a popular cannoneer. In all, he fired guns 27 times. Despite the cold and the rain, the atmosphere on Morris Island was festive and lighthearted. The men at the Confederate batteries cheered each time Fort Sumter fired a shot to honor the gallant Major Anderson, whose performance thus far was deemed very much in accord with the chivalry code of honor. For the moment, this was not war, but rather an elaborate, if perilous, form of sport. I talked about narrative at the beginning, didn't I? How we see the narrative. And the problem with the South is that it saw this in terms of the narrative of chivalry and of honor, and they did not take it down and see where it would lead. And of course, they were very wrong, weren't they? Because the North had more guns, more ammunition, more people, more industry. And at the end of the day, chivalry was going to die. So we have to be very careful what narrative we follow. Thank you. I hope it wasn't too much. I mean, the lady who did, she left, I guess she thought I gave too much about today.
No, I think it's all right. I think it was just that when, well, I know her because she worked here.
What?
But I know her because she works here, but I
Okay.
think it was just, she literally was like, I can't wait to go to the program. And she's like, I need to learn more about Lincoln.
But this,
It's okay. I think it was good.
well, but this book isn't about Lincoln. I mean, it's really not. I mean, he's plotting, but it really it's he's deciding what he's going to do. But it's really about about the fort itself and about Anderson and how Anderson's caught. I mean, there's not enough ammunition. There's no way he can survive on that fort. It's also interesting that that he has slaves, that he's from the South, and he doesn't resign. Lee resigns and becomes the head of the Southern Army because he can't abandon his state. But Anderson remains in the Union Army, which I thought was very interesting. Yes.
Let me grab that.
A point that you made early on that I feel we didn't emphasize enough was the fact that Lincoln was not a strict abolitionist.
Was not what?
Was not a strict abolitionist.
No, he was not.
In the very beginning of this, and yet the Southerners were reacting to fear that all of this would be taken from them, and he was very much characterized as an abolitionist.
Yes, and
so when you talk about narrative, that I think that's at the heart of it.
I that's part of it. They were much more comfortable, of course, with Buchanan. They were much more with Buchanan as president, and when he left, of course, it became a problem. Yeah, he was not abolitionist, but he was Republican.
Yes.
He was Republican, and that was and abolitionism is part of their platform. Yeah.
And I know you were trying to draw up parallels between now and
Yeah.
then. And I think the quote that always sticks with me is if you don't learn from your history, you are doomed to repeat it.
Absolutely.
And so that's what I see a lot of the things that are being,
Yes. Yes.
fighting against or just trying to come to a common agreement. We're having a really hard time doing that.
Yes,
I have it in my family.
Yeah, everybody.
Having friends, so it's hard.
It's hard, yeah. But I do think, yes. If we don't learn from history, we're repeating it. But I do see that. Yeah, I see patterns that are most disturbing. Anyway, I hope this was helpful. Did you like? How did you? What?
Just to be able to distill it
I-
in 55 minutes.
Well, I mean,
Very helpful.
I'm just hoping you enjoyed it. I thought it was a good read. If you haven't read, I would suggest another book by Doris Kearns Goodwin, An Unfinished Love Story.
Even better, listen to it because she has clips in it of Johnson's
Oh.
speaking